bioenergy industry in Europe. And also to act as the main interlocutor of DG RTD to implement a strategic energy technology plan in the field of biofuels and bioenergy. The mission is to develop cost-competitive world-class bioenergy and biofuels value chains, to create a healthy bioenergy industry with well-articulated goals, as well as links to societal challenges and industrial transformations. Also to accelerate the sustainable deployment of biofuels and bioenergy in the EU, to promote knowledge-based research, technology development and demonstration in the field of bioenergy, and to assist in joint coordination of research and technology development for low carbon technologies. And then SBP, the purpose of SBP is to facilitate economically, environmentally and socially responsible use of biomass to enable to meet climate goals. They have 4 strategic objectives: to ensure certification systems to meet the promise of good biomass, to maintain robust, credible, and consistently applied certification of woody biomass, while also trying to reach higher level of excellence, to inform, educate, reinforce, and reassure stakeholders that SBP certified biomass equals good biomass, and to achieve right stakeholder balance and skill set to strengthen the brand and pursue responsible growth. So by now, about 60% of the pellets, the industrial pellet consumption in Europe is certified by SBP. And our last speaker, Adam, will also tell you a bit more about SBP later on today. So I think I stopped sharing the slides. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. So this workshop was originally planned for spring this year in Brussels, but it was cancelled because of obvious reasons. But we are now very happy that we can host this event online, and which is also makes it possible for other parties to join. And I think the previous 2 editions of the webinar showed that this online format works really well and offers much opportunity for engagement and active participation of a wide audience. We have many people enrolled for this webinar today. I think about 250 participants. I'm not sure how many have joined so far, but from the 250 participants, about 25 are from academia or have research-related jobs. 20% comes from consultancy, 13% represents biomass producers, 10% represent end users. Then we have 10% are accreditation and certification bodies. And besides it, we have trade and trade organizations, NGOs, forest owners, regulatory, and others to join us. So I think it's a very nice, diverse set of participants. And I think that's also enables to meet, to learn from each other's viewpoints and to learn from each other's knowledge and experience and perspectives. So for all of you, please note that we will be recording this meeting. The breakout session will be private and won't be part of the recording, but the recording will be used to also make a summary of this event, and it will also be published online. So if you have a bad hair day, then you can switch off your camera. But just to avoid to have only a wall of black tiles, it's also nice if you can share your video, and especially when we have the breakout session, have online debates. The focus of today's workshop is the implications of the use of biomass for energy for biodiversity and how to ensure that using biomass maintains and protects biodiversity. And I think scientifically, biodiversity is a challenging topic due to the variability on taxonomic groups, on levels of vulnerability, the different indicators and the different geographical levels to measure biodiversity. And the impact of energy on biodiversity depends on what type of biomass resources used, how it's managed, the biophysical conditions, the location of extraction, and also what would be the counterfactuals. And there, of course, the issue of data availability, which also is a challenge. So no wonder this is such a complex issue to deal with. So how to capture such complexity in policy and how do we implement this? So not to be pessimistic, but I don't think we're going to solve this challenge today. But given the great lineup of speakers and also the great variety of participants in this workshop, I'm very optimistic that we are able at least to make a step forward in this and also to find common ground in identifying what are the key areas of agreement, but also what are the key areas of disagreements, and also what are the knowledge gaps and what could be possible steps forward. But foremost, I hope we can learn a great deal from each other's knowledge, experience, and viewpoints. And today we will touch upon different topics. So what does the science tell us? So how can we measure biodiversity and landscape level impacts? How can standards address this? And how can we use the theoretical and scientific concepts in implementing and monitoring this on the ground? So what we'll be doing today in this workshop, we have a lineup of 6 excellent speakers today. We have asked the speakers to pre-record a long version, so about 20 minutes version of their presentation. And these have been available on HouseSpace for the past days. So I hope many of you had already the opportunity to watch some of those videos. And if not, don't worry, they will be available for the coming days. So even after this workshop, you will be able to access them and to watch the entire videos. And today we have the short version of these presentations for 8 minutes. So some of them will be live and some of them will be the pre-recorded version of these short presentations. You have the opportunity to ask questions for clarification right after all the presentations. You can also already respond to the speakers and their presentations on HouseSpace in the designated area for that. So after all the speakers, we have some few minutes for clarification questions. And after this, we have prepared 4 questions for debate. And we have some time at the end of the plenary to reflect on those questions and also to prepare for the breakout sessions. Then we have about 30 or 40 minutes for the breakout session, depending how long it will take. And we are very happy that we have about 10 facilitators that can help out with moderating these sessions. And then for the last hour of today's workshop, we reconvene at the plenary session, and we like to hear back from what has been discussed in these breakout sessions. And we would like to hear from you what you think is the common ground, where are the key areas of disagreement, and how can we move forward. So that is about the outline of today. But before we go to the speakers, I would like to give the floor to Dirk Hoeverscheid. He's the technical facilitator of today. And there are many practicalities that we have to deal with as we have to work on 2 platforms. So maybe Dirk, you can help us out here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Floor, for a great introduction and already outlining the flow of today's session. And again, it's a 3rd one now in a row of 5. So we've taken on the learnings from the previous 2 ones, and let me go and share briefly on how to best participate during the different parts. Floor already mentioned the overall timeline. By previous estimates, all the speakers would take us until around 4 o'clock, 10 past 4 o'clock Central European time. And then we would have time for the breakout groups, where by experience, some people of you actually opted out. Usually we had about 60% of people participating actively in the breakout groups. The other ones came mostly with an interest to listen into the presentations. And I think everybody has a full understanding that that's fine. Is in the first round, we had a lot of orphaned breakout groups. So when we come to the point of where the breakout groups will be happening is, I will ask all of you who don't intend to discuss actively to actually go and leave the Zoom call until we reconvene in plenary. So we actually do have active breakout groups that want to discuss, and we don't have a lot of empty black tiles in it there as well. And that worked extremely well in the second webinar. So please be prepared when I tell you it's time now to leave. And then we will reconvene around 5 o'clock Central European time for the plenary session, where we will create a synthesis and you can hear from the outcomes from those breakout groups there as well. Now, the place that Floor has mentioned is called HouseSpace. For most of you, it's probably already a familiar tool. It's like a gigantic structured discussion chat box, which goes far beyond the possibilities that we would have with a Zoom messaging chat there. So you find the link in the chat box here on Zoom, and where you can register. Now, when you go and sign up for the first time, you just have to type in your email address and click on the register button, not on the login button, in terms to get your dedicated personal email. And then with one click, you're inside directly. Now, you will find all the presentations, the long recordings, and the PowerPoints later on that page. And that's also the space on where you can actually go and contribute in the different comments and questions for each of the speakers. Now, we have about 150 to 200 people probably joining us today. So please make sure that you use the opportunity to document and share your questions as quickly as possible on the house space. Our speakers will continuously monitor it and use that also to provide some sort of feedback and inputs along the way. And of course, you can like comments from your colleagues as well. That makes the arguments appear a little bit higher up on the list. And you also have the possibility to click on the reply button, which of course is then meant to keep an engaging discussion even after our session ends at the end of today. If you have any questions around the house space, please send them to me directly in the Zoom chat box, and I try to help you around any kind of issues there. Back to Floor. Will you announce our lineup of speakers now?
Yes, thank you, Dirk, for talking us through the practicalities. And I think there are obvious reasons or obvious downsides of not having this face-to-face meeting. But I think having both these platforms offers for very flexible interaction. So I hope we can make up for that a bit. And I think the previous sessions have proved that it's a very nice, flexible tool for this.
Yeah. Sorry, Flo, before we go on, you mentioned two platforms again. Just a little bit a practical tip for the ones who are joining us for the first time. I would go, and if you take your screen, I would have your Zoom window with all the speakers on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, and then open the house space in a separate window next to it, so you can actually easily navigate between the two different platforms. Yeah, sorry, that was just a little bit a practical tip.
Thanks, Dirk. Yeah, I think that works best indeed. So now I would like to introduce the speakers. We have 6 speakers today, and we start with Dan Berger-Kuzelewski, and I really hope I pronounced that well. I'm sorry if I didn't. He's from DG Agri. He works as a policy officer at the European Commission at DG Agriculture and Rural Development in the unit Environment, Forestry and Climate Change. His work is now mainly related to forestry and the implementation of the EU forest strategy, renewable energy and climate change, with a focus on agricultural emissions and land use change and forestry. And he will be talking on the biodiversity perspective from DG Agri. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, good. So first, thank you for introducing me. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. So I will just jump directly into what I prepared for you today. It will be a short speech. I don't have a PowerPoint, but bear with me. So I think we can all agree that there is a growing acknowledgement on the important role that forests play in addressing the challenges of our time, such as sustainable development goals, the Paris Agreement, and the protection of biodiversity. And we have the communication on the European Green Deal, which sets an ambitious vision for the EU to become a sustainable and climate neutral economy by 2050. And forests play an important role in this regard. And while globally the forest area is decreasing, it's important to say that in the EU, the forest area and the forest growing stocks are increasing. So this is the opposite. And forests today cover 45% of the EU land. However, still more has to be done to address the challenges related to ongoing global biodiversity crisis, climate change, and to cope with other problems such as rural abandonment. And there are calls for strengthening the efforts in the forest sector to preserve and restore healthy ecosystems. Against this context, and according to the Green Deal, the forests need to be managed sustainably, improve both in their quality and quantity, and be adapted proactively to projected climate change to effectively support the EU's climate and biodiversity objectives and the development of the circular bioeconomy, including in the rural areas. In this spirit, the Commission adopted a new EU biodiversity strategy this year that makes emphasis on the forest biodiversity. And despite the action taken so far, the implementation of the EU biodiversity policy remains a major challenge in Europe. The report Reports on conservation of forest habitats and species show no improvement so far, and further work is still needed, especially to guarantee that Natura 2000 areas are effectively managed and achieve their objectives while contributing to the sustainable development of rural areas. We should not forget that 50% of Natura 2000 area is actually forest land. In this regard, the current forest strategy highlights the potential of forest management plans or equivalent instruments for balanced delivery of goods and services. The integration of biodiversity in these plans, which was one of the objectives of the former biodiversity strategy, has progressed. However, further efforts are still needed, and the new biodiversity strategy also says that we should have forest management plans for all public forests and increase the area covered in private forests. The current EU forest strategy, which is valid until end of this year, puts forward sustainable forest management, a concept which is central also to the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is important to underline that the SFM is a dynamic and evolving concept intended to maintain and enhance economic, social, and environmental value of all types of forest for the benefit of present and future generations. As such, the concept of forest multifunctionality is crucial at finding the right balance of carbon storage, raw material supply, biodiversity conservation, and provision of other services, and in a world of changing climate will demand mobilization of innovation, knowledge, technical capacity, and expertise, and demand strong coordination. For following the sustainable forest management, we also have criteria and indicators, and in total 45 indicators, and 9 of them for biodiversity, which were developed under Forest Europe, which is a process gathering 46 countries, including the EU, and the member states report every 5 years based on these indicators. However, the reporting is voluntary and non-binding. These criteria and indicators are under constant review. However, also in the internal discussions, we see that there are some aspects of the SFM which are more easy to demonstrate than the others. For example, we have market and economic aspects which are easier to compile and demonstrate compared to, for example, biodiversity, which is more difficult to monitor. Due to this, there is maybe a need to consider how to further strengthen certain dimensions of SFM, including biodiversity, but also the social functions of forests. I think this is also something very interesting to be discussed today. So how further work on demonstrating that SFM and there is biodiversity in the forest, how to monitor and demonstrate that what is being done on the ground actually contributes to biodiversity. So it is important to state that the use of forest biomass, a bit on talking on bioenergy and renewable energy directive now, that biomass for production of renewable energy is, in this context, an important element, as it is often perceived as incompatible with biodiversity conservation. The revised Renewable Energy Directive sets out a series of sustainability criteria on forest biomass for energy, including protection of areas and considerations on maintenance of biodiversity. And in line with the Renewable Energy Directive, the Commission will also adopt operational guidance in 2021. The new biodiversity strategy has, as part of its increased ambition to protect and restore forest ecosystem and the need to strengthen the efforts to curb the biodiversity loss, taken a more limiting approach to the use of wood production of energy, stating that the use of whole trees and food and feed crops for energy production, whether produced in the EU or imported, should be minimized. The Commission is thus assessing the EU and global biomass supply and demand and related sustainability to better understand and monitor the potential climate and biodiversity risks, and will publish the report by the end of this year. This report will inform the Commission policymaking, including the review and revision where necessary on the level of ambition of the Renewable Energy Directive. There are also debates on the uses of forest biomass, so for what it should be used, and about wood harvesting levels. It is important, in our opinion, to understand the causes of the recent increases in wood harvesting for example, whether these are due to an effective increase in demand due to bioenergy or bioeconomy, or are there other causes such as natural disturbances, bark beetles, and storms, which will also have a long-term impact on biodiversity in the future. Before I finish, it's also important to remember that forests are managed by many forest owners or people on the ground who may also need the support for doing this work. So we have the rural development programs and the common agriculture policy, which provide support for forest owners and managers to implement sustainable forest management, invest for climate change adaptation, and provision of environmental or other services. Forests will also continue to be on the spotlight in the future, the CAP, to increase forest area, secure healthy and sustainable managed forests, enhance the role and contribution of forests for biodiversity, conservation, and to build more resilient forests. To conclude, let me by saying that we will take everything that I mentioned above into account when we will be preparing the new forest strategy, which will build on the current new biodiversity strategy. And this new forest strategy will be adopted first quarter 2021. And we already published the roadmap, which is now available for public feedback, and I invite you to have a look and provide us also your input there. We also will publish an open public consultation to gather further input from stakeholders and citizens. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your presentation. And maybe you can also help out with providing links to the publication you mentioned that are already available. Maybe you can provide them in the house space.
Yes, I can do that.
Perfect, thank you. And for all the participants, if you have questions to Dan, please put them in the house space. And then in the meantime, when the other presenters are giving their presentations, you can have a look on the questions. And after all the presenters, then we have some time for clarification. Okay, so with that, I would like to move on to our next speaker. That is Gillian Petrikowski. Gillian is a founding partner of Oxford Systematic Reviews and an associate researcher with the University of Oxford's Long-Term Ecology Group. She has been conducting systemic reviews and systemic maps for over 10 years. She had set up and led a collaborative international project, Evidence-Based Forest Initiative, and continues to work on outputs related to that initiative with scientists, policymakers, and practitioners, focus on questions of high priority to forestry and related land use. She will be talking on a systematic evidence synthesis on biodiversity impact of woody biomass. Gillian, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Jill Petrikowski from the University of Oxford and Oxford Systematic Reviews, with a brief summary of the longer presentation available in this workshop. The research question we set ourselves was, does pellet production in southeastern USA harm biodiversity? And this against a backdrop of increasing demand, particularly from Europe with its 27% by 2030 policy target, and an increasing production from mills being built in the southeast USA. And this increasing production in the southeast USA, of course, bringing with it controversy from those who want little or no active management of forests in the region, and those who point to the region's long history of sustainable forest management. In other words, this is broadly a debate between those seeking to protect nature from any use and proponents of production forestry. The question we looked at, does pellet production in the southeastern states harm biodiversity or not? What's the evidence base for this? Looked at studies measuring impacts of managing forests in part or wholly for bioenergy in comparative studies and looking at any reported measurements, impacts on terrestrial or freshwater species. Very comprehensive search strategy ensured that we had a very large number of potentially important studies to look at, and we used machine learning to help us get through these. So having looked at and found 20,000 articles potentially of interest, in fact, we ended up with 143 articles, which themselves produced 211 studies in all parts of the southeastern USA. And from this work, we've published an interactive evidence map, which you can use, free to use, and it allows users to. This interactive map has a number of options that enable users to filter for a number of study design questions, for example, type of biodiversity indicator, type of forest, type of forestry operation, and also to temporal considerations, duration of the study, was it long or short-term experiment, or time after the forestry operation. Is it shortly after deadwood extraction, for example, or several years after a clear cut? Each of the circles on the map is the site of a study, and each study is associated with a data sheet. This just shows the top and bottom part of those data sheets, which you can look at from the map itself. So essentially, the results showed a great disparity in number of organisms that are reported in the literature, huge dominance of birds and amphibians, very worrying lack of studies on fungi or non-vascular plants or aquatic species. The results of these analyses showed us that in fact 69% of the studies reported no negative impacts of any of the forestry practices we looked at on biodiversity. And a complicated picture emerged of the 31% of studies that reported at least some negative impacts. Different taxa were affected by different management practices in different ways and to different extents. The negative impacts to biodiversity are largely reported across studies of short duration conducted shortly after the intervention. There's a dearth of long-term studies from which to draw inferences of forestry practices on biodiversity for the wood pellet industry. These short duration stand level studies do not really allow extrapolation to the landscape scale, and longer term studies would be necessary to understand the long-term impacts of the industry in the region. It's recognized that successional habitat changes will impact adversely on some species, but perhaps positively on others. And these changes interact with management intervention in ways that are not captured in studies of short duration. Similarly, there were few studies taking a landscape ecology perspective, and a future challenge will be to explore how biodiversity, as measured at the landscape scale, such as population viability and functional habitat responses, could be integrated in decision-making for the sector.
That's it?
That's it, Flo.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you for presenting the evidence found in literature. And I can imagine that it sparks quite some questions with our audience. So I would like to encourage you, everyone, for all the participants, if you have any questions about this presentation, please put them on HowSpace. And at the very end, we have some time for clarification. And with that, just for the sake of efficiency, I would like to proceed to our next speaker, to Vivian Quist-Johansson. She's a senior researcher from the University of Copenhagen in the Department of Geosciences and Natural Resource Management. And she's heading the section of Forest, Nature and Biomass. She has been working on forest research in 1993 and chaired the initiation of the National Forest Inventory in Denmark in 2002. And she has been involved in this program ever since. And our main research focus is on trees and forests, the condition and development of single trees, stands, and for the country as a whole. And she will provide the perspective on biodiversity impacts from woody biomass from a national reporting perspective.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I'll just make sure. So, hello everyone. I've been told I have very few minutes, so I'll just go briefly through this presentation with the perspectives from the national reporting. So, Trees grow in a cycle as individual, but is part of the forest. Harvest is also done by a single tree, but also affects the entire forest. So that's one of our challenges. Besides the trees, the forests also include bacteria, fungi, flora, fauna, and sometimes even humans. So that's our challenge. Oh, I can see my slide is doing something that I didn't want it to do. Sorry. Um, anyway, uh, biomass and sustainability is a key issue since 1987. And we can use biomass for multiple uses, energy or construction and storage in long-term products. That's also the issue in this UN sustainability goal, where forests and biomass affects multiple of these and also biodiversity. So that's our challenge. In Europe, we've had this focus on sustainable forest development management, and we've had focus on ecological, economic, and social cultural indicators, and has developed a long list of indicators, of which we already heard there's 46 in total. I'll go through a few of these based on some of the data that is available. These are the global data from FAO, it's the EU from Forest Europe, and then I'll just throw in a few slides on the Danish forest statistics just as a perspective. Forest area is one of the key issues in terms of securing the biodiversity and the biomass. And in global scale, we have a progress in the terms of forest area in Asia and Europe, and a decline in South America and Africa. In Denmark, we actually had afforestation for 200 years, giving us a dramatic change in our area. This also influences our carbon stocks. And actually, we can see that the density in terms of tons per hectare has been increasing, at least many parts, but the area changes causes the overall carbon pool to be decreasing in some areas of the world, South America and parts of Africa, and increasing in Europe and East Asia and also parts of North America. So that's an integrated part of this. Forest fires is one of the threats to our ecosystems, and it has been increasing in some years, and most recently also been very dramatic in Australia and US. The relation between incremental fellings has been mentioned before, and of course it's important both from the perspective of sustainability, but also as it reflects both changing utilization, changes in techniques, changes in age structure, and that influences the forest and what we can get out of it. So for example, for Denmark, the afforestation is now visible as we have changing outcome, but also the techniques influence what we can get out. Biological diversity is one of the key issues here. Naturalness depends on the history as well. So even though the plantation only makes up a total of 7% of the forest area globally, some areas have a history of long-term afforestation, like in Denmark, where we have 2/3 of our country being even-age plantations because that's where we're coming from. So are we using native species or introduced species? Well, it depends on where we are on the globe and what types of management we can have. In North America, they're using native species. In South America, yet they are typically using introduced species in the plantation forest. So that's some differences. Dead wood is one of the issues often mentioned for biodiversity. It's a key habitat for many species, and even though the volume is not very large, it's dramatic importance for many of the food chains, starting with the beetles and the fungi relying on the dead wood. The development depends also on the site and the local conditions and also the management. A topic which is often missed is the genetic resources and how they are influencing the conservation and the options for climate adaptation and mitigation in the future. There we still have a limited data source for the documentation, and few species are actually conserved for this purpose. Protected forest is essential when we have the separation or the integration of the functions. The protection separates and set aside areas from strict reserves to areas managed primarily for biodiversity. The area has been increasing and there's still room for more, but the important part is that that's an indicator, and also the actual location of these sites are important for evaluating whether you have sustainable use of biomass and how you protect the biodiversity. So how do we ensure that using biomass maintains and protects biodiversity? Well, we need reporting and monitoring both at national level and at the state level in a transparent, reliable, and a consistent way over time that can give us sufficient data. And this is just some of those actors involved in that. So my take-home messages is, how do we ensure this? Well, we need multiple scales that are needed to answer the questions on this. From in situ monitoring, including maybe even DNA monitoring, barcoding to remote sensing to get the overview. So that integration is essential. That we also need to ensure stability of both the natural and plantation forests, including focus on genetic resources and providing access also to good resources for doing afforestation. In the international and national reporting, we need a summary of indicators that are consistent over time and protocols and definitions. In that way, we can ensure transparent and reproducible documentation as a basis for supply of sustainable biomass while protecting biodiversity. And at the same time, those transparent data can give additional value to the biodiversity while we're providing biomass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for your presentation, and also for pointing out once more that it is indeed very complex, that it all depends on local conditions, on management, but also on history, and also on the interconnection between the different functions of a forest.
Yes, thank you.
Please have a check the house space also if everyone have questions to your presentation, and we can get back to that later on. And with that, I would like to move on to our next speaker, Healy Hamilton. She's a chief scientist at NatureServe, a Western Hemisphere biodiversity information network focused on management and conservation of at-risk species and ecosystems. She's a biodiversity scientist with degrees from Yale and the University of California, Berkeley. And she is a member of the IUCN US Executive Committee as a fellow of the World Conservation Monitoring Center and the president of the Society for Conservation GIS. And she will talk about how the use of data on biodiversity could help to advance sustainability of forest biomass in the southeast of the US. Healy, the floor is yours.
All right, sorry, it took me a minute to get unmuted. Are you seeing the correct slide here in full presentation mode?
Yes, all is good.
Okay, that's good. Well, it's wonderful to go after the previous presenters because they touched on important concepts that I'd like to develop here a little bit further. I am going to focus on data, biodiversity and ecosystem data in the United States for my presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with NatureServe, we are a biodiversity information network that was stood up almost 50 years ago by the Nature Conservancy originally. So this is a network of programs, biodiversity information programs throughout the United States and now in every province in Canada and most of the countries of Latin America. And this network of programs that are called natural heritage programs in the United States, all of them are populated by botanists and invertebrate zoologists and zoologists and ecologists and data managers, and all of them collect very foundational information about biological diversity with an emphasis on non-game species. So the other 99% of biodiversity besides the things that we hunt and fish, which includes fungi, as Vivian just mentioned. And sorry, my neighbors decided to clean their yard. Close the window. The beauty of Zoom from home. So we collect fundamental information about what species taxonomically are we talking about, where is it found, so distribution information being very important for these kinds of management questions. How is it doing? We conduct conservation status assessments, which we have performed on over 80,000 species in the US. And then management questions that help us understand population trends. So I want to talk about how we can use the collective information from the NatureServe network to develop metrics that allow us to measure biodiversity in ways that might be relevant for forestry practices and for being able to assess the sustainability of biomass production. So I am not going to talk about genetics, which is a foundational way of measuring biodiversity, and Vivian touched upon environmental DNA as a possible new and promising technique for being able to assess genetic presence or absence and diversity of species, but everything above the genetic scale. So presence or absence of species or ecosystems that are imperiled, and then some of those higher spatial scale metrics, such as at the landscape or at the region. I believe that we have the possibility to combine observation data, monitoring data, ecological modeling, and advances in computation, plus the huge amount of information coming from remote sensing to develop a suite of metrics that can support understanding biodiversity impacts of managed forests. In our network, this is the power of over 50 years of on-the-ground monitoring, on-the-ground observation effort. This is the collective location of the most imperiled species in the United States that has been produced by over 50 years of biodiversity inventory of natural heritage programs. But that information, let me touch here one more moment. That information is rigorous, but it's only good for where we have been. It is completely dependent on the extent of our surveys. In order to improve our ability to understand biodiversity across the landscape, we need to commit to ecological modeling, where we can use our known occurrences with modeling approaches that allow us to, at fine spatial resolution, predict the habitat for species. And here is one for a critically imperiled salamander species from the southeast, where we have some known parts of its habitat, and the yellow shows us where we are predicting its habitat. This allows us to inform our survey efforts and to give us a better understanding of the potential presence of imperiled species. So at NatureServe, we are investing in predictive modeling at scale. We have generated a national map with over 2,200 vetted distribution models for our nation's most imperiled species. And it allows us at very fine spatial resolution for a suite of taxa, for example here, imperiled aquatic invertebrates in the southeast that you see in the bottom right, where the brighter colors indicate the more imperiled species co-occurring habitats. We've also worked a lot in ecosystem mapping, and given existing information that we have about the modeled historical extent of forested ecosystems versus the current extent of those ecosystems, we've been able to make maps of what degree are ecosystems imperiled. So based on the loss of their geographic distribution and the disruption from different environmental processes. So here the orange and red pixels indicate forested ecosystems that we know are imperiled or vulnerable. And so these maps already exist and can be brought to bear on all kinds of ecosystem scale metrics. Then we can look at landscape scales, such as spatial pattern. Forestry is so important in our understanding of how the landscape is configured, and that is a metric that is valuable to biodiversity and can be measured in real time using models and satellite information combined with on-the-ground observations. So this is where here in the darker blue, we have larger habitat patches, and we're able to understand how those patches are configured. And this matters to biodiversity, especially under a changing climate. And finally, habitat connectivity. We want to understand the opportunities for biodiversity to flow through the landscape. This is another metric at large spatial scale that can be measured with current information. So just quickly reviewing these different suites of metrics from species to ecosystems to landscapes and regions, that with a concerted effort to properly incorporate monitoring data that SBP and SFI and FSC require, if we use that data wisely with other types of data that we have, such as from the NatureServe network and other monitoring efforts, and we leverage ecological modeling and computational advances, we can maybe then think about dashboards that offer us a very transparent and real-time way to understand what is happening with biodiversity on the landscape. I think I went over by a couple of seconds, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Healy, and also thank you. I think you kept time very properly, so thank you for that. And many thanks for pointing out the possibilities with all this data. And I think many nations are maybe a bit jealous when it comes to the data availability in the US. So it's also nice to see that there are also possibilities a way around it with modeling. So I would like to encourage also participants to ask questions on the house space. And for the sake of time, I would like to continue to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Olivia Schultz. Olivia joined the HCV network after many years of managing landscape level conservation projects, mostly in Africa, but also in South America and Australia. And she's an expert in wildlife protection and monitoring and brought these skills to the HCV assessment in Central Africa. Now her projects focus on working with standards to adopt and implement the HCV approach. And she has many roles within the HCV network. And she will talk about how the high conservation value approach can help sustainability standards to deliver environmental and socioeconomic benefits. And I think Olivia pre-recorded her short presentation. So in the meantime, she could maybe keep track, you could keep track, Olivia, of the questions that come in on house space.
Hello everyone, I'd just like to start by saying thank you to the event organisers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event and to talk with you about the high conservation value approach, which is a tool for protecting critical environmental and social values in production landscapes. SPP's feedstock standards already makes reference to high conservation values in 2 of the biodiversity related criteria, and high conservation values overlap with at least 4 criteria in the standard, including criterion 2.5 on the rights of Indigenous people and local communities. And during this presentation, I will go through the basics of what the high conservation value approach is, how it is used, and how the approach is a useful tool to deliver landscape, environmental and social impacts. My name is Olivia Schultz and I am Senior Project Manager with the High Conservation Value Resource Network. We are a member-based organisation that was established in 2005, and our objective is to encourage the uptake of the approach, but also the robust implementation. I'll talk about some of the tools that have been developed by the network to achieve this goal, and specifically how these can support implementation of the SPP standards. So what is the HCV approach? Very simply, it's a 3-step tool to identify and conserve 6 categories of critical environmental, social and cultural values in commodity production landscapes. So before I talk about the details, I'll just give a bit of the background of where it came from and where it's used today. It first appeared in FSC Forest Management Standard 20 years ago. One of its strengths is that it really focuses on critical values, both environmental and social, which in most cases people agree should always be protected. And since then, the approach has been adopted by a number of other standards and commodities. At least 20 sustainability schemes include reference to HCVs. And it is used for a range of applications, including land use planning in the expansion of crops, but also to improve social and environmental safeguards across landscapes in non-conversion contexts. And in recent years, tools have been developed to support smallholders implement HCV requirements and standards. So the approach is also used in a whole range of contexts outside of certification. This includes due diligence requirements, sustainable sourcing commitments, and as a tool for landscape or jurisdictional land use planning and prioritization. So in summary, it is globally one of the most recognized frameworks for identifying and protecting critical values, with guidance and tools to support implementation in a range of contexts. So a bit more about the values. There are 6 categories with global definitions. On the environmental values, the first category is significant concentrations of biological diversity. The second category is about landscape level ecosystems, including intact forest landscapes. And the third category is rare, threatened and endangered ecosystems. Category 4 is basic ecosystem services in critical situations and is really the interface between social and environmental values, including access to water and fire and flooding controls. HCV category 5 and 6 are about the basic needs and cultural values of local communities and indigenous people. So these are therefore identified and management agreements put in place through consultation with communities using the principles of free, prior and informed consent. So I'll cover some of the key concepts in the approach. Firstly, the objective is to maintain and enhance HCVs, and this is done through 3 steps. It starts with the identification of the values, followed by an assessment of the threats from which appropriate management decisions can be taken. So this can include set-aside areas, but also things like reduced impact logging if this is consistent with maintaining the values. And then carrying out monitoring to verify if the management decisions are being effective. The approach takes into account the landscape context, and this is important for a number of reasons. High conservation values can be present across the landscape or depend upon a mosaic of habitats. Practices within a management unit can have impacts that extend beyond its boundaries. And stakeholder consultation is part of implementing the approach, which provides stakeholders within the landscape with a common level of understanding of the values and threats, and to support a more coordinated approach to addressing these risks. So tools have been developed for several scales of implementation. At the landscape scale, a screening approach is used, which is a desktop exercise to identify the risks, and I'll talk through this in a bit more detail in a moment. At the management unit level, an assessment is the starting point to identify risks associated with management and the specific management and monitoring measures. And as mentioned, more simple risk-based procedures are also available for smallholders. So the landscape screening is a useful starting point, particularly for sustainable sourcing, and I'll talk through how this works. So here on the left is a very simple schematic of a landscape, which can be a region or a jurisdiction. And first one considers across this landscape the probability that HCVs are present using existing data to do this assessment. And so here in our landscape, the green indicates the areas of low probability of presence and the red indicates high probability. One then goes on to identify the threat factors and intensity of threat, high and low. So here we have low in green and high in red across our landscape. And the overlay of these risk factors generates the landscape HCV risk outcome. So we have 3 risk outcomes: low in green, medium in orange, and red in high, where probability of presence and threat overlay. So this risk analysis is captured in the HCV screening guidance that was published by the network last year. The series of steps in the guidance covers the risk analysis, but also as a multi-stakeholder process, the use of the outcomes, the use of the risk outcomes can be used to prioritize measures that should be taken in higher risk areas. So linking this more directly to SBP biomass producers, the HCV screening can be used to conduct the regional risk assessment of the supply-based evaluation on the indicators that include HCVs. And the screening provides information on whether BP's biomass producers are producing from medium or high risk areas, what additional measures may be required of the suppliers to mitigate those risks if impact mitigation through forest management practices is possible. The screening also provides buyers a basis for identifying opportunities to collaborate with stakeholders to deliver landscape benefits to high conservation values. So in conclusion, the approach has been perceived to be complex, but a range of tools have been developed using a risk-based lens so that implementation is simple but sufficiently robust when needed. As a multi-stakeholder land use planning tool, it encourages voluntary landscape coordination. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I look forward to hearing feedback on your perception of the value of the high conservation value approach in the SBP standard, and also the landscape screening as a tool for implementation.
Thank you, Olivia, so much for your pre-recorded presentation. And nice that you pointed out also both that it is a standard approach, but then also flexible for taking into account local conditions. You can post questions in the house space, and we can come back to that later on. With that, I would like to continue to our last speaker. That is Adam Harrison. Adam Harrison is trained as a forest ecologist, and since the 1980s he has worked in natural resource management, development and conservation policies and practice in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the UK. He worked for WWF in the UK on forestry, farming, and food policy at a national, European, and international level. And he was the vice president of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. He is currently a freelance consultant and is the chair of SBP Standards 1 and 2 working groups. And he will talk about SBP certification and biodiversity. So we will listen to his pre-recorded presentation.
Hello, my name is Adam Harrison. I'm the independent chair of one of the 3 working groups that the Sustainable Biomass Programme have established to revise their standard. I'm going to summarise some of the key points that I made in my longer presentation, which looked at how SBP certification currently deals with biodiversity and how that is changing during the revision process. SBP first launched their standards in 2015, and there are now some 300 certificate holders in the EU, the US, Canada, Russia, and a small number elsewhere in the world, producing about 60% of the industrial demand for biomass for energy in Europe. Working Group A, which I chair, is tasked with revising Standards 1 and Standards 2. Standard 1 sets out the principles, criteria and indicators that define what is legal and sustainable woody biomass for energy, while Standard 2 sets out how the biomass producer can verify that a feedstock meets Standard 1. To do that, a biomass producer needs to undertake a supply-based evaluation to identify the risks within their sourcing area that Standard 1 is not or might not be met. If those risks are identified, then the biomass producer needs to implement a mitigation program to address those risks, or they need to ensure that that biomass is not entering their supply chain. SBP assures compliance against Standard 1 by recognising other forestry sustainability standards, namely FSC and PEFC, or if those aren't available, by directly auditing the producer against Standard 1. There are 2 principles in Standard 1. The first is that biomass feedstock has to be legally sourced, and the second principle is that it is sustainably sourced. Legally sourced biomass is defined both in terms of having a supply base which is mapped and defined, but then also recognises that there's compliance with law. There are specific laws which are also referenced within the criteria, including compliance with CITES, as well as having royalties and tax paid. And the Principle 1 also looks at the requirement to have a legal right to use land which is not contested by other users. Principle 2 is made up of a number of criteria which address the main social and environmental impacts of biomass production. Now, looking at these more closely in terms of which criteria are directly addressing biodiversity, there are 3 criteria in Principle 2. Criteria 2.1, which requires that features and species of outstanding or exceptional value are identified and protected. Criterion 2.2, which requires ecosystem function to be assessed and maintained. And criterion 2.4, which requires that forest ecosystem health and vitality is maintained. There are a number of other principles and criteria which have a supporting role in biodiversity, one of which is of course the compliance with CITES, which controls the trade in endangered species. But there's also criteria 2.9, which requires regional carbon stocks to be maintained or increased, and criteria 2.10, which bans the use of GM trees. Looking more closely at the 3 main criteria which address biodiversity issues within Standard 1. Criteria 2.1, which requires features and species of outstanding value to be identified and protected, mentions high conservation values at an indicator level, although not technically by using the HCV approach. It is referenced in the guidance to this criteria, and in addition there is a ban on sourcing from land converted of various types converted after 2008. This ban on land use change has a direct implication in terms of supporting biodiversity, as it is one of the criteria which is recognised. Criteria 2.2, which requires ecosystem functions to be assessed and maintained, is made up of an indicator level requirement to undertake impact assessments and to plan and implement and monitor the mitigation measures which would lead to ecosystem functions being maintained. It specifically requires that key ecosystems and habitats are conserved or set aside in their natural state, and it actually also has an indicator level requirement for biodiversity to be protected. There are also requirements in terms of the removal of residues to minimise harm to ecosystems, and a whole suite of issues around minimising pollution from air, water and impacts on soil, all of which environmental measures will have an impact on improving the condition of biodiversity within the supply base. Criteria 2.4 requires that forest ecosystem health and vitality is maintained. That again requires that at an indicator level that those ecosystems are maintained or improved, and it also has an indicator which requires protection of the forest from unauthorized activities such as illegal logging, mining and encroachment, and within that will also be issues like poaching and hunting of wildlife illegally. So as you can see, there are a number of ways in which the standard currently ensures that biodiversity is not damaged and in some degrees enhanced. But the SBP standard has been running for 5 years. We'd like to learn from the experience of certificate holders in implementing the current standard, but also changes and developments in civil society, academia that are pushing forward our thinking about biodiversity. So where is our thinking about the standard and how we deal with biodiversity? There's a number of issues that I'm going to raise which might be interesting to hear your feedback on. The first step that I think we're going to take is to actually formalise the HCV approach in the standard, in particular make sure that monitoring is embedded within the standard as a requirement, and also making sure that we're referencing the latest toolkits and guidance from the HCV approach. We'd also like to take this opportunity to consolidate how biodiversity is addressed across the standard. It's talked about in terms of high conservation values, also biodiversity, but ecosystem functions and key habitats. And I think there's an opportunity there to rationalise this and make it more coherent. In particular, I think we'd like to explore how we can move beyond just ensuring that biodiversity is not damaged by biomass production, and how we can start delivering benefits for biodiversity, particularly those at a landscape scale. I think the SBP approach to certification, by looking at have a supply base at a regional level, really lends itself to seeing how actions within the forest can deliver those sorts of landscape benefits. We're particularly keen to make sure that that suppliers are also able to deliver biodiversity outcomes rather than just having to rely solely on certificate holders to do that. So we're looking at how issues like due diligence and contracts can be designed to better make sure that everything going into supply base meets the highest standards. We'd also like to make sure that all the sorts of supporting measures and indirect requirements within a standard are also delivering wider biodiversity benefits. So obviously restrictions on things like land use change have a direct impact on making sure that key habitats, which may well be biodiversity rich ones, are set aside and maintained and conserved, but also issues like pollution, water use, soil impacts, requirements for buffer zones, riparian areas, and I'd be really interested to hear what other ideas some of you might have about that. We're also very keen to make sure that Standard 2 is revised in relation to how thinking has evolved on biodiversity, and we're particularly keen to look at the HCV screening toolkit and how that might be of use to SPP, both in the undertaking supply-based evaluations, but also the regional risk assessments, which are key to making sure that the supply base meets Standard 1. So there's a whole range of issues here, which I think would be really interesting to debate, and I'm very keen and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, for your pre-recorded presentation. I think it's very nice that you pointed out once more the relevancy of the content as well as the timing of this workshop and how it could contribute also as input to the SPP criteria. For the sake of time, I would like to have a very short Q&A. So I would like to ask the speakers to have a quick look at the house space and scan the house space area if there's any urgent question on the content. And I will go just from top to bottom. So Dan, is there anything on the house space that you would like to respond to?
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity. I think I got 3 questions that can merge 2 of them from Martin and Simon, which is about the use of the term whole trees for bioenergy. I think the biodiversity strategy sends just a clear message that certain types of trees should not be used, or their use should be minimized if there is other potential for them. But further, the clarifications and specifications of what that exactly will entail will have to come up in the potential review of the Renewable Energy Directive next year. And also regarding this, I think the open public consultation on this revision will be also published soon. So I think your input would be valuable at that point. And the other question from Zoltan Kuhn, it's about the area or amount of wood that will be needed in the EU for material production or for other uses. And as we don't have really this kind of calculations, because we don't say we have to use this much wood for energy or this much wood for construction. We do try to encourage sustainable use of sustainable wood, for example, in construction, as was said recently in the communication on renovation wave, but we don't have these kind of numbers. But indeed, these kind of the targets that were put forward will also have to be looked into, that we don't outsource the problem, for example, of use of wood from other countries. So that basically, we protect more in Europe, but that means that we have to import everything from other countries. So perhaps this might not be the best way, because that might lead to deforestation in the other parts of the world, if we don't have very strict criteria also on that. So I think indeed there will be quite a lot of discussion still on this also in the coming months. Yeah, thank you.
Many thanks, Dan, for your response to the questions. And also, I understood you could not stick around for the breakout sessions and the plenary later on. So I would really like to thank you for your participation and response to the questions. And I hope you may be later available also to respond to questions later on house space. But it was very nice of you for setting the scene. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me, and wish you a fruitful continuation of the meeting.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to continue to Gillian. Gillian, do you have any questions that you would like to respond to?
Thanks, Floor. Very briefly, I've been trying to keep an eye on these questions. A number of people picked up on the issue of a lot of the evidence base that we had is not showing negative impacts. This doesn't mean to say that there aren't any negative impacts. And they've also picking up on the issue that these are short-term studies in specific locations. So I'm really happy that people have picked up on that. And in fact, if you boil it all the way down, of the 31% which do show any negative, only 9% are actually attributable in some way to the wood pellet industry. So I think it's as with all science, it depends what you look at. And there's an enormous amount of potential biasing and skewing of data from these relatively few studies, which tend to focus on things like birds and the easier things for people to pick up on ecological studies. And so I completely agree with what Adam said in his talk as well, that this land scale approach, I think, particularly for a new standard that you guys are putting together, is going to be critical. So thanks for the really super interesting questions. I'll give them more attention as we go on, but that's a snapshot of answers. Thanks, Flor.
Great, thanks, Gillian. And indeed, we can continue the discussion on the Housebase platform. Vivian, do you have any question that you would like to address?
Oh, well, I tried to address them on the Housebase already, but there was a question on, actually, it was, if I'm taking just in the order that they are on my screen, whether plantation is forest or not. And actually, I do see them as forest, because that's just a start of a restoration of a forest land. And then it starts out by having even-aged forest, but it will turn into kind of a more diverse forest as it takes time. And they fulfill the criteria for being a forest. Another issue is how we kind of, whether we can use native or non-native species. And as I have written here, actually see in Denmark, we have had the experience that non-native species like the Norway spruce, which is, by the way, native to both Germany, Sweden, and Norway right next to us, it actually caused us to be able to restore some of the very degraded land we had in Jutland. And now in the second generation, we can see that some of the native species can actually start growing there. They couldn't that in the first phase. So sometimes you need to introduce other species which may not be native to your direct homeland, but will actually have a function in the ecosystem on the long run. I was also asked by the genetic resources, and definitely I think that should deserve more focus, both in terms of our monitoring, but also in terms of how we do the restoration aspects, especially in the light of climate change. So, but I will definitely follow up on the questions and hope to be able to provide some more feedback. So thank you.
Thank you, Vivian, for clarifying that. Healy, do you have any question that you would like to address?
Sure. Yes, so one of the comments that has come my way has been, well, that's really great for the US, but good for you that you're such a data-rich country. Are similar analyses available to us in other parts of the world? And I really want to encourage us to embrace that we are in a time of extraordinary biodiversity observation through citizen scientists, where humans are now sensors of the environment, to fleets of microsatellites, to drones. There is so much information that is coming in about biodiversity and ecosystems. Then we are also experiencing sort of revolutions in ecological modeling and advancements in computational capacity. And the three of those things together merge into extraordinary possibilities for generating indicators of biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, these are always going to be models. They're going to be hypotheses. But the beauty of these types of hypotheses is that you generate a bunch of maps that then draw attention to where we need to be verifying them. New inventory on the ground, verification. And that's where the monitoring efforts that all of you undertake or that your suppliers undertake can feed back into those models so that over time, the data are always improving. And so I see a lot of potential in our ability to be leveraging computational capacity and ecological modeling and observations to always be generating information that is better and better. And that should lead to a great improvement in regional risk assessments to the benefit of all involved.
Great, thank you. And thank you for pointing out that the flow of information can be in both directions, right?
It needs to be in both directions, that's right.
Thanks. Let's move on to Olivia. Olivia, do you have any questions from the house space that you would like to respond to?
Yes, hi. There is one question that was about the most, asking about the most effective monitoring approaches for certificate holders on high conservation values, of course. And I guess wanted to point out the risk-based approaches embedded in implementing the high conservation value approach. So the amount of effort for monitoring HCVs is dependent on the level of risk. So if you're producing or sourcing from higher risk areas, then you will put more effort into monitoring. And the regional risk assessment in the supply-based evaluation is, as I mentioned, the starting point to identify if you are sourcing from high-risk areas. And it also then specifies the mitigation measures that would be required if it is possible to mitigate those impacts to continue sourcing from there. So in terms of approaches to monitoring that biomass producers can be taking, if they're sourcing from medium or higher risk areas, then the first thing is to verify if their suppliers have operational procedures to mitigate those risks. The next level is to monitor if the suppliers are implementing those operational procedures. And then, of course, it's to monitor impacts on HCVs themselves. And I think this is where, if biomass producers are engaging in landscape level solutions, then collaboration to monitor those impacts at the landscape scale could be the most effective and interesting way of approaching that.
Thanks, Olivia, for pointing that out. And I think there could be many more questions on how the HCV approach actually works. So maybe you can also direct them to relevant documents on your website, maybe in the house space area.
Good idea, thank you.
Thanks. And then last but not least, Adam, do you have any questions on the house space that you would like to respond to?
Well, I have already responded in the house space to the questions I had there, but I guess there's a sort of a general theme that's coming out of all of the talks in my head about the availability of data and the need for monitoring, particularly monitoring at a landscape level. And I think that's been my impression of the SPP's certification is that it's something that could well be strengthened in this next revision. It's something we're certainly working on. But another area which is also, I think, coming out is, and something we're trying to tackle in the working group, is how the responsibility for the effort can be shared between different parties, obviously between the certificate holder and their suppliers and their contractors who are doing actions on their behalf, and how do we organize that? But also in terms of thinking about something like monitoring, how the effort could be shared between, again, the individual certificate holders, but then also SPP itself, and how do we aggregate some of this data so that we can talk about what impacts biomass production has had and how that's changing because it's becoming more sustainable. So I think there's some really interesting themes in there, and I think it's really interesting to hear them.
Great, many thanks, Adam. I think I would like to thank the speakers once more for setting the scene of this workshop. I think you were well able to point out the complexity, not only of biodiversity as such, but also in the interrelations with other impacts and other functions of the forests, but also luckily pointing out to the possibilities of data, of indicators, of certification schemes. So I hope that is a very constructive start of a constructive discussion. Before we move to the breakout sessions, I would like to give you some homework, because up until now for the participants, that was the easy part. You could just sit back, ask some questions, be quiet. but it is a workshop, so also some work, active participation from your side is expected. So to prepare for the work for the breakout sessions, we have prepared 4 questions for debate. And before moving to the breakout session, we would like to have for you to have a look at those questions and already answer those questions. We give you very limited time for this, but we want you to already look at those questions and think about this question to make sure that we can have an effective start of this breakout sessions. But I think, Dirk, you can tell the participants a bit more about how we go about this.
Yes, thanks a lot, Floor. And now it's your turn. We've prepared 4 short statements or questions for you. If you go into the house space and there is a different tab right on the top is where you see Webinar 3, 9 November. That was for all the speakers. And then there's another one called Webinar 3 Discussion. It's the one which is also in the Zoom chat box right now. If you click on it, it should take you right there. So the first one is a poll. We would like to know, should any standard regulation in general on bioenergy require forest owners to either only avoid harming biodiversity, or they should actually go and deliver benefits? Or certainly it should be either or, and please go and share your comments in the box next to it. And we just give it a minute for you to make up your mind. And please feel free to comment your choice in the chat box next to it. So far, it's a pretty tight race.
So final seconds to respond to this question, and then the poll will close.
Yep, well, the poll will stay open, but we're going to move forward and people can add to it later on. So if you go and click next on your screen, the next one would be, should biodiversity requirements for woody biomass feedstocks for energy be different to those for other forest products? And here your choices are, yes, there should be different additional requirements, or no, they should be the same for everything. And again, the other option. This looks quite different from the first one where we had a tight race. Here we have a very clear dominance of the no, should be the same requirements corner. But please feel free to share why you think there should be different or additional requirements in the comments box. That should all inform the breakout group discussions later on. And the final seconds are coming in. And finally, if you click on next, the next question would be around when it comes to biodiversity standards and indicators, how to handle the trade-offs between capturing the complexity of biodiversity and the feasibility of its implementation and monitoring. And feel free to like or reply to any of your colleagues' statements. Yeah, this should all start and initiate a debate and not just be a collection of comments. So you have about a good half minute to go. All right, at the last 10 seconds are starting. Let's go on to our final question, which some people have already given it a head start. How could standards such as SBP better incorporate sustainability safeguards?
So we have a few final seconds to respond to the final question. So these questions were just like a warming up session for your brain. So it helps to have to kickstart the breakout session discussions. So we will now start the breakout session. Luckily we have moderators for each session that can help to structure the discussion and also to help out with reporting back to the plenary later on. Dirk, some practicalities?
Yes, so practicalities, based on experience, I think 25 minutes for the breakout sessions is a good time window. For all of those that would like to just take a break now and don't participate in the breakout groups, it would be great if you could leave the Zoom so we can have fully functional and active breakout groups, and we can do a better balancing around it there. You're more than welcome to join us back for the plenary session, which will start again at 5:10 Central European time then. So basically in half an hour from now on, and that would then include for the people in the breakout groups, a short tea break as well. Yeah, so let's give it 30 seconds for the ones who can't participate in the breakout groups and to leave and come back at 10 past.
Okay, see you at the other end.